Why is Nirvana now considered classic rock? And how come there isn't a wave of new rock bands really breaking through and becoming famous like they used to? What are some of the pros and cons for rock bands when it comes to the internet? These are some of the questions I asked to JJ French, the lead guitarist from Twisted Sister. This video is the full first interview I did with JJ French for my documentary, What is Classic Rock? If you want to see the full documentary, the links are available below.
The internet and social media has changed the music industry completely. It is a different world than the world that we started out in. And for us, for bands like us, who rely on ticket sales, not on album sales, I would think we're happy that the music is disseminated over every possible platform you could possibly have for free, because people will hear it that never heard it before, and then all of a sudden you are in demand in places that you could never think that you'd be in demand. In the United States, not exactly the repository for classic rock bands to be successful, but Europe and South America and Asia and India, the Middle East, believe it or not, are huge places. And these are places that have just recently been exposed because of the ability of young people to listen to this stuff, and they discover it and they think it's their own. I mean, I think it's kind of funny. The average age of our fans in the United States is 40 to 70, 40 to 65. The average age in Europe is 20 to 60, and the average age in South America is 17 to 22. And you know, these kids weren't born when our records came out, and so they discovered us on the internet, and they fell in love with us and Motley Crue and AC/DC, and they want all of us. They want the originals, and they demand it, and they pay a lot of money for it. And so the ticket prices are only mirror the fact that we don't make money in any other way, really, but playing live. New bands have a much harder job. They don't have a ticket fan base, and no one's buying their records or stealing it. So that's a whole other world for them and a whole other challenge for them to succeed. We are the beneficiaries of the bizarreness. I will say the flip side of social media, by the way, in helping you, is that it can hurt you. So if you suck, it used to take months for people to know you suck. Now they find out in seconds. So you better be damn good every time you play. Ultimately, things will shift. It'll have to evolve, because again, if you look at the epicenter of the age, I mean, take the baby boomers, the classic rock listeners. Well, these guys are 65 years, you know, these people are 65 years old, you know, so where's the 45-year-olds going to be listening to? I think it's just a natural evolution of what will be considered classic. I mean, classic rock has to be broad-based, has to be popular, has to have filled arenas. And there's certain things about it that have to be something. They have to have really meant something to a large enough group of people so that it matters, so that it continues to carry on. I think that holds true, by the way, even in the classic rock world. There are bands that never transcended the popular song and the popular ticket sales to create enough of a market for people to care about them. I mean, God, there's a million bands that came out of our era, but not a million bands are on classic rock radio. There's a handful. And those handful became a handful because they meant a lot to a lot of people, and that will continue to go on because Pearl Jam certainly sold a lot of records, Nirvana certainly sold a lot of records, Alice in Chains, Red Hot Chili Peppers, these bands sold a lot. But whether it's going to ultimately come into the 90s and the millennials, or the aughts as they call it, you know, where they're Fall Out Boys and be considered classic rock, is going to be a matter of whether or not the genre sustains itself as a descriptive genre for radio. And will radio even be around in 20 years? I mean, what does it even matter? Everything is changing so rapidly. It may be just ridiculous to even theorize what it's going to be like in 20 years. Maybe there won't be radio, and maybe it's not going to matter. You're going to just have your own little private streaming device to play for you whatever you want. You're not going to have to rely on someone else's determination of what they may consider the music that you think you're supposed to like at a certain age. Well, I think the advent of shows like The Voice and American Idol have given this impression that A, singers rule the world, and B, that you can be famous in 15 weeks. And I find that kind of comical. Not that I take away any success from anybody, because life is hard, and if you're going to, you know, put yourself out and get yourself through the vetting process of these basically they're game shows, and then have to do it on TV live, you know, I give you a certain respect for that, because everyone tries every avenue you can. And I'm not saying that avenue wouldn't have been taken by my singer, maybe, if he had to have to do that. On the other hand, when they thank their fans for sticking with them for 4 months, I mean, I find it rather comical. We have been together 40 years, and so is Scorpions 50 years, and so is Kiss, and so has Aerosmith. So we've been through it. We've been through hell. Our ability to be great performers was forged with the fires of the club scene and all that entailed. These kids don't have that. It's instant gratification. So the problem I have is it sets up this unrealistic expectation. And of course, the sad part about it is, for some shows like The Voice that really haven't made anybody particularly famous, is that they create these momentary stars for young kids, and they have to process this superstardom where their whole towns are, meeting them at the airports and holding up flags and banners. Hey, we welcome whatever. And then after their single drops and it bombs, they're back to anonymity again. And what happens? And I find it interesting to read those backstories of those people, because they're not great backstories. Maybe some of them are very psychologically grounded and they can put it in perspective. Jennifer Hudson was recently asked, you got voted off of American Idol, and she said, yes, I did, and it was crushing to me, except now I have an Academy Award, I have a Grammy Award, I may get a Tony for being on Broadway. She didn't allow it to destroy her. She came back. That's a wonderful story. I mean, that is a great story of determination. Sudden fame at an early age, regardless of how it comes, is problematic. My view of punk music may not be the classic view of punk music. First of all, Twisted Sister evolved out of a glam rock scene that was spearheaded by David Bowie, backed up by Mott the Hoople and Lou Reed, and in some ways crystallized by the New York Dolls look. But if the Dolls were a pre-punk band, meaning they couldn't play their instruments, they had an attitude, fine. But I saw the Dolls back in '72, and my assessment of the Dolls in '72 was, here's a horrible band, I don't care how you dressed it up. They looked great, and they had a wonderful attitude. I used to see them every Sunday night at the Mercer Arts Center. And I would go back because it was like a car crash. I wanted to see it. It was amazing. I was like still an Allman Brothers Grateful Dead guy at the time, and I was morphing into a glitter person at that moment, and thought if the Dolls only played really well, they'd be really good, but they didn't. And David Johansen has said that. It's not a secret, that they didn't. Lou Reed, the Velvet Underground may not have been a great live band, but Lou Reed was a genius, and he wrote really phenomenal songs. But when it morphed into punk, Twisted Sister was playing in the bar scene at the time in Long Island. So when the punk scene happened, we knew what the Ramones were about. We knew what the Dictators were about. This wasn't a political statement. This was kind of like we can't play very well. We think Foreigner sucks. We think corporate rock is like nauseating, and we want to play 3 chords, and we love Phil Spector and the Ronettes or whatever. Or it was the Handsome Dick Manitoba and his funny view of the world through the eyes of Andy Chernoff. They were funny stuff. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't political. It was just kind of funny. So all this was happening tangentially to us, So they're in Manhattan, and we're in Long Island in New Jersey. Like, we're only maybe 30 miles as the crow flies from CBGB's, but we have nothing to do with it, except we're observing the scene as it's evolving. And when the Sex Pistols came out, I thought the Sex Pistols were great. I thought they were phenomenal. I thought punk was interesting. Totally an interesting thought. I thought it was bastardized over in England. I thought it was curious. And then Twisted Sister, ironically enough, was signed by a punk label in England because they saw us as revolutionary and insane. And they put us on a label with the Exploited and the Cockney Rejects. It doesn't get much more punk than that. These guys were starving to death. The members of the Exploited was our road crew during our first tour. Wonderful guys. We were in London in 1982. Went to the clubs. Everybody had, mohawks, and it was a great scene. But I can't say that we looked at it in any other way other than, wow, that's kind of an interesting scene, but that's not our scene. In terms of how punk fans viewed Twisted Sister, again, we were from the suburb. Well, we were playing in the suburbs, and so we never ran across the New York City scene. So we had a massive following, and our fans just came to see Twisted Sister and do what we did, which was revolutionary. We were doing performance art on stage. It wasn't just the songs we were playing. We were actually, the Death to Disco thing was a performance art piece for us, as well as many other things we conjured up on stage because we were playing 5 nights a week. The difference between us and these other bands were that we could play 5 nights a week to thousands of people. These bands are playing to nobody. I mean, CBGB's was one thing, But when you took these bands out of CBGBs and you put them even in the clubs around the tri-state area, they weren't drawing anybody. They couldn't draw. They couldn't sell records. They couldn't draw. So we were the antidote to that, to our fans, and our fans never really had an issue. The big issue, the schism, was between disco and rock. It was never punk versus rock. So we never saw that. If you were a punk fan and you lived in Long Island, you went to New York City on occasion to see those bands, you came out to see us, you could exist on both sides. We had no issue one way or the other, but I could tell you that the punk bands didn't function well in the tri-state area because the tri-state area more or less was middle America in a way, and so they wanted their bands to be more substantive. They wanted the musicians to be able to actually play, not just bitch and moan and scream about how much the world sucks. So you had Rat Race Choir, that was a Jethro Tull, Pink Floyd band, and you had Southern Cross, and they were an Allman Brothers copy band, and you had Zebra, and they did Zeppelin, and Twisted was just a weird hybrid of a mishmash of stuff. We did all different kinds of metal bands, but we did it our own way. D, to be fair about his songwriting, was always he was an angry young man, right? So maybe D had a punk ethic, behind him. He wrote anthems. He was an Alice Cooper fan, and he was angry, and he wrote songs. And maybe that is what resonated and crossed over to the punk label A&R people in England when they signed us. Bands like us who've been together 40 years wind up doing the same thing. They go out on tour, believing the fans want to hear the new music, and they're playing 5 songs from the new album. After the first week, they're playing 4 songs. After the third week, they're playing 2. After the fourth week, they're down to 1, which they're grudgingly playing because nobody really gives a damn. And that's just the way it is. I mean, I don't care what people say. That's the reality of the situation. If you're a great entertainer, you will understand it and you'll embrace it. If you want to reinterpret your music, you do that at your own peril. Why? Because most fans want to hear it the way they heard it on the record. That's how they are programmed, or how they hear it on the radio. Most bands make that mistake. They think they want new interpretation. They don't. Do some? Yeah. Do most? No. We survive very successfully because we acknowledge, and that's how we perform, and that's how bands like us perform, because we have become essentially a moving Las Vegas show, where our parents would go to Vegas to see their stars because their stars didn't want to tour. We are just Vegas, but we're moving. And so is Kiss, and so is AC/DC, and so is Aerosmith, and on and on and on and on. That is what we do for however long we can do it. Is Zeppelin a metal band? Or is Zeppelin just a rock band? Or are they a hybrid rock metal band? I mean, they do folk songs, so therefore, how much metal could they be if half the songs are done with acoustic guitars? Are they metal because John Bonham, had that massive drum sound? I guess one can argue this point over and over again. The earlier metal bands tended, not always, because Sabbath certainly didn't do a ballad in the early days, nor did they use an acoustic guitar, but they tended to have some variety. I think once the line was crossed into Slade territory, the band Slade purely celebrated super heavy, loud rock. I mean, Slade was rock and roll, but metal. I mean, super, super loud, like heavy duty loud, like grindingly, punishingly, rebelliously, insanely loud. What's the difference in them and Motorhead? They were funny. They wrote much more hooky type songs, but if you ask Lemmy and Noddy Holder, they'd probably have mutual respect for each other for what they both did. Motorhead just kind of took it over the line in another direction that maybe have assumed to be heavier, but I don't know if they were any louder. Not if you actually compared the two's SPL levels, or Deep Purple for that matter, who I think hold the record for the loudest band on earth. They wouldn't be rolling off your tongue as a metal band. Deep Purple would be a hard rock band. You'll get people arguing this point. Commercial success vis-a-vis pop radio destroys or hurts your career in the eyes of the so-called super metal fans whose older brothers don't want the younger brothers to like their music. I remember when we're not going to take it across the threshold from 19-year-old metal fans to 8-year-old fans, and it scared the hell out of me. We were in the middle of our Stay Hungry tour, and we were in Philadelphia, and we were playing at the Spectrum, and I went across the street to the Veterans Memorial Coliseum because the Mets, I'm a Mets fan, they were playing. So I'm in the stands, and we're in the middle of the tour, so I had my hair turned back, I had a hat on so nobody would recognize me. And I'm sitting there, and while I'm sitting there eating a hot dog in between innings, an older brother, the two brothers, I'm assuming they're brothers. Guy looked like he's 19, the kid looked like he's 8. They're walking up the stairs, and the kid's going, "We're not gonna take it. We're not." And the brother's looking at him going, "Shut up." And I'm thinking to myself, we just lost that guy. Like, we lost him. Are we going to lose more? It really scared the hell out of me because we had crossed over that line. And then that October, I was watching some college football game, Michigan versus Ohio State or something, and the band comes out in between, and they go, "Dun, dun, 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 dun." That scares the crap out of you because then you realize that once you have the mothers and the kids, and then you're no longer, horrible, and then that takes away your credibility. And so maybe metal has a lot to do with also what you wouldn't listen to. However, go to an AC/DC concert these days, and there's parents and their kids, it's not that far away, but AC/DC is acceptable. And then you see the Rolling Stones, and you see 5 generations. AC/DC has always had an enormous sense of humor, and that lightness makes them non-demonic, really. And have always been the acceptable hard rock band to the heavy metal community because their attitude is so. And it's really funny stuff, and they write great, great, great songs. And they're like the Grateful Dead of hard rock because every song sounds the same, but you can't get enough of it. If you're a Deadhead, you want to listen to that. And if you're an AC/DC fan, you don't mind the same 3 chords are used over and over again. They somehow figure out a way to do it, and you love it. As far as them being heavier than some of the earlier hard rock metal bands, I don't know about that. Blue Cheer's first album, 1968, they weren't called heavy metal back then. That was bludgeoningly heavy. Maybe the loudest album ever recorded. They did it on a pier, in the middle of San Francisco Bay. I mean, that's how loud it was. They were super loud and super, super heavy. So there's a little of a blurring of the line because a lot of heavy metal bands will say that metal is just blues rock turned up really loud. Since we play predominantly European metal festivals in the summer, I guess the template for classic rock would be a perfect example of looking at the lineups of these shows, because the promoters of these shows have to deliver to their core audience what their core audience believes to be the bullseye of, in their world, their classic rock world. So who are on these bills? You will see predominantly European bands with some American bands. So you'll see Scorpions, and you'll see Def Leppard, and you'll see Whitesnake, and then interspersed with that you'll see Kiss, and Guns N' Roses, and Twisted Sister. Oh, of course, I'm sorry, Deep Purple too to be mentioned. Amongst this, these are the bands that always play these festivals. So Motorhead is not necessarily a classic rock in the United States, but it's classic rock over there. Def Leppard crosses over both. Whitesnake does cross over both. Kiss obviously is both. Twisted is obviously both. Deep Purple, interesting because they're revered in Europe. Scorpions revered in Europe more so than in the United States. You don't hear, you hear Scorpions and you hear Deep Purple on the radio, but I think that they're more revered there. So I think I think all these bands are an example of the groups that we play with. Now, if you look at the basis of these bands, if you look at Deep Purple, well, their basis is they're a blues rock band that evolved. And if you look at Whitesnake, it's a blues rock band that evolved. I think a bigger picture is to look at the Mount Rushmore of bands, which is Beatles, Stones, Who's Up, Floyd, and Queen, and look at their derivations and see what made them so unique. And I think that's a rather interesting view of it, because the Beatles and the Stones were pure rock the Beatles were pure rock and roll. The Stones were blues. Pink Floyd started out as a blues band. They were a blues band. People tend to forget that was the whole point. They were named after 2 blues artists, and they were a blues band. Zeppelin was a blues band. Queen was not a blues band. You can tell that Queen had classical foundations behind them because Freddie Mercury had classical foundations behind him. You don't find that particularly in American classic rock. You find American classic rock to be much more rock and roll based, much more fundamentally blues based.